Hello, friends, and welcome back to r/ProRevenge. We start with a funny story with a satisfying ending. I hope you enjoy it. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. Here we go. I paid for an hour. Not me, but it happened while I was at a trade show in Vegas to the guy in the booth next to us. This was about 15 years ago. At the time, we were a small company, and because of this, we could only afford the cheapest booth way in the back. We referred to it affectionately as the slums. All the big players had huge booths up front, while we were in one of the last rows in a 10x10. If anyone has set a booth up at one of the big trade shows, you know the unions run them very hardcore. Any little extra you want is a cost. You can't do anything yourself. It's amazing, even at that time, what things cost. Internet, power, carpet for your booth, etc. Well, the first day is all vendors and a crap show. Some people are there all day setting up. We showed up about noon, spent about 30 minutes setting up, and then went off to get a drink. We met the guy next to us who was all by himself as we were leaving, shot the crap for a minute, and then bounced. To see a trade show go from the vendor setup to a functioning show with booths and everything is a sight to see. The first day is dodging forklifts, people, and getting lost because there isn't much order yet. The next day, things are cleaned up, signs are up, and everyone is ready to go. We stroll in about an hour before the start of the next day. We have our coffee, sit down, and start talking about the antics we had the night before when the guy we met yesterday asks us if we wanted to hear a good story, and he begins. So what the unions do at the end of the day is pick up all the garbage and vacuum all the main aisles. What they don't do is clean up each individual booth. That costs extra. Our neighbor set up his booth, then noticed his 10x10 carpet was a mess. He leaves his booth in search of a vacuum cleaner and eventually tracks down a union guy and asks to borrow a vacuum cleaner. The guy says he'll send someone over. Great. An hour later, a union boss shows up and says he has to pay for a minimum of an hour for someone to vacuum his booth. Our newfound friend said this is ridiculous since it should take less than a few minutes. The guy says, sorry, those are the rules. Our friend is pissed, but his booth is messy, so he agrees. Another hour goes by, and a guy with a vacuum cleaner and work order show up for him to sign, something like $100 to get his booth vacuumed. He signs, and the guy gets to work. Literally a minute or two later, the guy is done and starts to pack up. Our friend asks him what he's doing. The guy says his work is done. My friend tells him it's not. He's paying for an hour, and he'll get an hour. Union guy's PO'd and goes to get his boss. A little while later, the boss comes back and asks what the issue is. My friend shows him the work order, says he's getting charged for an hour and the guy has only spent about 2 minutes worth of work vacuuming. He wants his full hour. The boss looks at him, looks at the paperwork, sighs, looks at the union guy and tells him to get back to work. That guy vacuumed the carpet for an hour while our friend watched. He said it was the biggest FU back to them and well worth the money for the cleanest carpet at the show. To this day, it's a story I still think of when I go to trade shows and see the small 10x10 booths. I still have a good chuckle. And our second story. Seating people is more important than actually serving people. Disclaimer. I am in no way saying that I am a model waitress, just that I was trying to help out and make sure customers got good service. This took place years ago when I was in college. In my first and only waitress job, I worked at a Genghis Grill type restaurant where people create their bowl and bring it to the chefs to cook the food. My job was to seat people, bring them drinks and refills, give them the check, and clean tables. One weekend night, it was 2 other women and me. We were slammed. All tables were full, people were quickly downing their drinks, and the table turnover rate was high, which meant we had to bus tables and fill drinks constantly. I'd run back and forth all over the place, refilling drinks and cleaning tables so that new people could be seated. I did this because I wanted to help out and make sure people were getting good and fast service, and also because we tip share. On the off chance that I made it back to the front where the register was, I would be taking people's payments and maybe seating one table. My manager/supervisor was PO'd. She claimed that she and the other girl were doing all the work. I tried to explain that I kept seeing empty cups, dirty tables, and a long wait list of people. She demanded me to ignore their tables, only take care of my tables, and to seat more people. This B. Whenever I worked lunch shifts with her, she would always stand in the front playing Hanging with Friends, She'd barely check on her tables. Basically, she acted like she didn't give two craps about the job. And in my first 2 weeks, when I was being trained, I only got 50% of the tips that I would normally get. The reason was that whoever was with me had to work harder to help me out, so I already had to deal with 2 weeks of her lazy behavior, pulling more work than her, and only getting half my tips. I knew that I wasn't going to stay at this job for much longer since I was only working for the summer. So I did just that. I only took care of my tables, cleaned my tables, and checked out my tables. I constantly walked by table after table, impatiently waiting for refills or their check or dirty and needed to be turned over. I mean, we were 10 to 20 tables that needed their waitress, but I ignored them. Screw my coworkers and their tip money. I complied with the demands of my boss. Eventually, I caved. After having passed a family at least 7 times with empty drinks that were never refilled, I grabbed the pitchers and refilled their drinks because they didn't deserve this bad of crappy service. While talking to them, they asked if I was their waitress. I denied it, apologized for their lackluster service, and offered to find out who it was. Lo and behold, it was B-Boss. I walked over to her, now scrambling like crazy to serve and turn over her tables by herself, and informed her that one of her tables has been waiting for their check. When they were leaving, they left a pretty crappy tip, but then the grandma slipped me a 5. I remember watching my manager typing up the night's money totals in the company Excel sheet. We made a total amount that was pretty low compared to what we normally make on a weekend night, at least for me. I enjoyed the fact that she couldn't go clubbing with as much cash as she had intended. I kept up my compliance whenever I worked with her, and in the short few months that I worked there, I started having regulars who would wait for me to seat them, and more people started slipping me cash on the side, especially when there were other instances where she ignored tables and never refilled their drinks. So I didn't have to share those tips. Well, I'd turn in $1 or $2 for tip share, just to keep suspicion off me. And to make things sweeter, the owner notified us that we'd be closing down the restaurant to remodel. Since I was leaving for college soon, it didn't hurt me, but B was out of a job for months with no pay while she tried to plan her redneck wedding. And our last story. How a man lost $8 million for failing to be a decent human. All right, I have a story to tell from the finance industry. For those of you who don't know what we do, it's basically just being a realtor, but for companies instead of houses. This was a small investment banking firm. We specialize in smaller players. We're talking companies worth $20 to $50 million. Our customers are typically salt of the earth, built their tire company from nothing but a shed and a truck over the last 30 years, and now they want to retire. But seeing as how many of them never learned accounting and whatnot, they need representation. Now, one company has two 50% owners, and they hate each other. Can't have a civil conversation. Now, having two 50-50 owners is always a recipe for conflict, but this level of hatred was something I hadn't seen before. It was pretty clear that one of the two had done something pretty bad for it to devolve to this stage, so let's call that one Tim and one Roger. My first impression of Roger is that he's a nice dude, down to earth, chill, generally interested in things. My first impression of Tim is that he's a raging imbecile. We were at a restaurant that I and many other people in my city hold in a very high regard, and all he did for an hour and a half was complain about the food. He talked down to and mocked a waiter who dared to ask him what he'd like to drink and proceeded to order a $1,000 bottle of wine. He knew we were paying. My boss, having none of that, made it clear Tim is paying for that bottle, which I suppose put him in a bad mood. I'm somewhat obsessed with food. I spend an unwise amount of money on food. I can sing you all the instrumental parts in the opening to Heston Blumenthal's cooking show. We're here on my recommendation. I love this damn restaurant, and I'm on a first-name basis with that waiter. The man starts talking down to me about my tastes after I order, says kids these days have no palate, and that I should be eating X. Oh, and also apparently donating to vaccine charities is a waste of money, and I'm some sort of idiot for doing so. So to be short, I don't like the guy. But not liking the guy isn't really a reason to seek revenge. However, after talking to Roger, we found out why they hate each other. You see, Tim had been stealing money from his employees and the company. It turns out employees started getting random checks bounced, and the company's lines of credit kept drying up because Tim had been making some rather extravagant purchases on the company dime. He had adjusted employee payroll downwards and increased his own. He had used capital expenditures to build himself a house. Apparently, his continued justification is that none of what he did was illegal, technically true. He'd helped grow the company, I suppose, and that he deserved more, but not his business partner. Roger ended up comping employees out of his own pocket, and Tim refused to pay back a dime. So at this point, the deal talks are going nowhere, as in Tim and Roger just cannot stand to communicate with each other at all. But my boss, he hatches an idea. Why don't we just buy one of them out? We know how much the company is worth in the wider market. We'll just see if either is willing to take some cash up front for their share of the equity. I make models all day. I know how much this company is worth. It's worth about $24 million. Tim's stake is therefore worth $12 million. Complex, I know. Guess whose stake I suggest we buy? Tim's, of course. How much do I suggest we offer? $4 million. Now, to be clear, this type of thing has a downside, but Tim's reputation in his industry isn't good. In fact, after some canvassing, it turns out that most people know the company through Roger and don't like to deal with Tim. Turns out being a thieving a-hole is something one simply cannot turn off. Boss says okay, he'll send an offer letter, an NDA agreement, etc. Tim bites for $6 million. We sold the company 6 weeks later for $28 million total. F you, Tim. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.